You know, usually when we talk about the fall of an empire, our minds immediately go to these grand cinematic spectacles.
Oh, absolutely.
Right. Like we picture barbarians breaking down the heavy wooden gates of some fortified city. We see capitals burning, statues toppling in the town square.
Yeah, it's always this dramatic, sweeping collapse.
Exactly. Usually set to a swelling, tragic orchestral score in our heads, you know?
Right, the visual language of collapse we're accustomed to is always loud. It's catastrophic. We expect the sudden, undeniable shattering of the world order to announce itself with sirens and explosions.
But what if the actual warning signs of a collapsing global superpower are, well, a lot more mundane?
Hmm,
Like, what if the sirens don't sound like war horns? What if instead they look like a $17 piece of avocado toast in a Los Angeles cafe?
that is a stark image.
Right. Or a pristine $20 million mansion in Pacific Palisades sitting utterly empty, surrounded by perfectly manicured lawns, while absolute human misery unfolds just a few miles away on the pavement of Skid Row.
Yeah, that jarring, uncomfortable contrast is actually the exact foundation of the narrative we're exploring today.
It really is.
We are unpacking a deeply provocative theory that suggests the terminal symptoms of systemic collapse aren't exclusively found on foreign battlefields.
Right. They're not just overseas.
Exactly. They are baked into our daily domestic lives, you know? Our local economies, our financial markets, and ultimately our foreign policy.
So to guide us through this, we are doing a deep dive into a fascinating, and I really must emphasize this, a highly controversial interview.
Highly controversial.
Yeah, we're looking at a sprawling conversation from the Diesen YouTube channel. It features Jiang Xueqin, who is the host of a program called Predictive History.
And Jiang's core thesis in this interview draws heavy inspiration from a concept popularized by the historian Paul Kennedy back in his 1987 book, The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers.
Right, a classic text.
Yeah. Specifically, we are looking at the idea of imperial overstretch.
And for those of you listening, imperial overstretch is that historical pattern where an empire falls because its global strategic commitments, like its military bases, its foreign aid, its endless wars, completely outpace its actual underlying economic strength.
It's writing checks its domestic economy can no longer cash.
Exactly. But Jiang takes this historical concept and applies it to the modern United States and the broader West in a way that is incredibly explosive.
Oh, yeah.
He builds an argument that the U.S. is currently actively collapsing due to a toxic, interwoven mix of elite hubris, severe economic decay, and massive geopolitical miscalculations.
Now, before we go any further, we really need to establish a very clear, very firm baseline for you, the listener.
Yes, definitely.
The source material we are unpacking today contains highly opinionated, politically charged, and extremely contentious views.
It touches on everything.
Right. Jiang discusses U.S. domestic politics, global conflicts, the war in Ukraine, the Middle East, and foreign influence with a very specific, highly critical lens.
So consider this a massive flashing disclaimer. We are not taking sides.
At all.
We are not here to endorse these viewpoints, nor are we here to debunk them for some political agenda.
Yeah.
Our mission today is strictly to act as your analytical guides.
Right, we're just mapping it out.
Exactly. We're going to unpack the exact arguments and the specific narrative architecture constructed by Jiang Xueqin in this source interview. We want to help you understand the mechanics of how he is connecting these seemingly disparate global dots, even if you vehemently disagree with the final picture they form.
Think of this as an exercise in understanding a specific predictive model of history and geopolitics.
Right.
Whether you ultimately view his claims as a prophetic, urgent warning or as completely misguided geopolitical fiction, understanding the logic and the structure of his argument is incredibly valuable for navigating today's information landscape.
Well said. Let's start exactly where Jiang starts his narrative, because it is surprisingly grounded and visceral.
Yeah, he doesn't start in the clouds.
No, he doesn't launch into some grand lecture about troop movements in Eastern Europe or naval blockades in the South China Sea. He begins with a simple trip to Los Angeles.
Right. He mentions he was invited to L.A. by the comedian Theo Von to record a podcast.
Theo Von, right.
Yeah. And this everyday business trip basically becomes the magnifying glass through which he diagnoses what he calls the imperial disease.
He describes being put up in this luxury 5-star hotel in West Hollywood. And, you know, if you've never been, this is one of the most prosperous, aesthetically beautiful neighborhoods in the country.
Oh, yeah. Beverly Hills adjacent.
Exactly. You have gorgeous architecture, high-end boutiques, people driving supercars just to get their morning coffee.
Right.
And he steps outside his hotel for a morning walk. And right there on the pristine sidewalk in this affluent restaurant district, he encounters a pile of human feces.
Wow. And for Jiang, this is not merely a gross inconvenience on a morning stroll.
Right, he reads deeply into it.
He elevates this single moment, interpreting it as a profound, undeniable breakdown of the social contract.
He actually poses a rhetorical question in the interview. He asks, how in a society do you have people who don't care, who just feel, I can just in broad daylight take a dump in the middle of the street and no one cares?
Right.
To his mind, this signifies that society has fundamentally abandoned a massive segment of its population. Because the state has abandoned them, those people no longer feel they owe society any basic adherence to its foundational norms or, rules of public decency.
Let's actually unpack the mechanics of that claim by looking at the social contract itself, because that's important here.
Yeah, give us the breakdown.
It's a foundational concept in political philosophy, championed by thinkers like Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Right.
The core premise is this unspoken agreement. Citizens agree to surrender some of their absolute natural freedoms in exchange for the protection, order, and basic welfare provided by the state.
Okay, so it's a trade-off.
Exactly. So when you have citizens forced to live on the streets, resorting to something as desperate and degrading as public defecation in a hyper-wealthy area, Jiang is arguing that the contract has been rendered null and void.
Wow.
Yeah. The state is demonstrably failing to provide basic order or protection for these individuals, so those individuals have essentially opted out of the civilization entirely.
And the contrast he paints immediately following this is just staggering.
Oh, the dinner party.
Yes, the dinner party. He attends a dinner in the Pacific Palisades. This is an ultra-exclusive, gated enclave where a lot of massive Hollywood executives and stars live.
Very high-end.
Right. And he's standing in this $20 million mansion. And he notes how economically outrageous the luxury is. He describes a single family living there, supported by an entire army of domestic staff, inhabiting a space that could easily house 100 people comfortably.
It's just massive excess.
And the kicker is, he looks out the window, points up the hill, and sees another mansion that looks 10 times bigger than the one he's standing in.
This extreme wealth isolation prompts a conversation between Jiang and the journalist Max Blumenthal, who is also at this dinner.
Right, Blumenthal was there too.
Yeah, they are both struck by the sheer absurdity of the opulence. It bothers them so much that they actually leave the Palisades dinner party and drive directly to Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, specifically to observe the contrast.
That is a wild detour for a Tuesday night.
Right.
He describes Skid Row as a scene ripped straight out of a dystopian movie. He sees a woman walking around completely naked in the middle of the street.
Unbelievable.
He estimates there are 4,000 people down there, just completely abandoned by the system, living in tents and makeshift shelters.
And he also notes seeing homeless individuals everywhere around his luxury hotel at night.
Yeah. For Jiang, this isn't just a municipal zoning issue. This massive, unchecked inequality, this moral decay, where a government seemingly pretends thousands of suffering citizens simply do not exist. He sees this as a glaring, undeniable symptom of imperial decline.
It really boils down to the juxtaposition for him. You have the fortress-like, heavily staffed mansions of the elite existing mere miles from the apocalyptic, lawless reality of the underclass.
Right.
His argument is structural. He's saying an empire simply cannot sustain itself internally when the wealth disparity reaches this cartoonish level of extremity. The center just cannot hold.
Which brings us to the breakfast he has the next morning.
The famous avocado toast.
Exactly. He tries to find a quick, casual place to eat and ends up paying $17 for a single piece of avocado toast.
$17.
Right. Now, he acknowledges general inflation, but he pushes the analysis much deeper into macroeconomic territory. He argues this isn't just a story of a cafe raising its prices. This is the visible degrading of the fiat currency.
He's looking at it as a symptom of a much larger disease.
Yeah, he claims the U.S. dollar is losing its fundamental worth because the government has printed trillions of dollars out of thin air over the last decade just to sustain a dying, non-productive economy.
He specifically points to the U.S. national debt, which is hovering around $40 trillion.
40 trillion. It's hard to even conceptualize that number.
It really is. And he asserts that the entire domestic economy is floating on highly unstable artificial bubbles, rather than actual industrial production.
Right.
He specifically names the current AI boom and a $2 trillion private credit bubble as prime examples of this fragility.
Let's actually pause on the private credit bubble for a second, because that term gets thrown around a lot in financial circles, but rarely explained in plain English.
Yeah, it's a bit opaque.
Private credit essentially refers to loans made to companies by non-bank financial institutions like private equity firms instead of traditional regulated banks.
Right, the shadow banking sector.
Exactly. And these loans are often made to companies that are already heavily in debt. So Xing's concern is that because these loans are floating rates, and because they happen in this less regulated shadow banking sector, they represent a massive fragile house of cards.
Because if a recession hits,
Exactly. If a recession hits or interest rates stay high, a lot of these companies default, and that $2 trillion vanishes, pulling the wider economy down with it.
and that vulnerability is exactly what Jiang is highlighting. He views the expensive avocado toast and the massive national debt as two ends of the same failing financial mechanism.
The micro and the macro.
Yes. When you decouple your currency from tangible value and just print more to cover your debts, you dilute the purchasing power of the average citizen.
So wait, instead of looking at this as just a frustrating brunch bill, Jiang is looking at the $17 avocado toast as the canary in the coal mine for a catastrophic macroeconomic failure.
Basically, yeah.
But I do have to push back a little on his logic here.
Go for it.
Los Angeles has a very well-documented, highly specific homelessness crisis rooted in decades of local zoning laws, mild weather, and state-level mental health policies.
Right. It's a very localized issue in many ways.
And West Hollywood brunch is notoriously aggressively overpriced.
Always has been.
So, is a dirty street in L.A. and an expensive piece of toast truly a definitive historical sign of imperial collapse? Couldn't we just be looking at symptoms of localized urban mismanagement and regional inflation? I mean, a civilization could have a few messy cities and still maintain a totally functional, dominant global empire, couldn't it?
Your pushback hits on the most common critique of this kind of macro analysis.
Right.
The counterargument is precisely that LA's problems are uniquely Californian, driven by local legislative choices, and do not necessarily reflect the operational readiness of the entire American military-industrial complex or the federal government.
Yeah, they're kind of separate beasts.
However,
Yeah.
what Jiang is doing here is synthesizing these micro-experiences to build a theory about the psychology of the nation.
No, the psychology.
Right. He isn't just saying LA is messy, therefore the Navy will fail. He's using LA as a microcosm for a broader national alienation.
How does local alienation connect to the national psychology, though?
Well, it goes back to his point about the population no longer having a vested interest in the status quo.
Okay.
He argues that when you have a significant portion of the populace feeling totally alienated and economically crushed, whether they're literally living on Skid Row or whether they're working-class people who simply can't afford basic groceries anymore, they become a revolutionary powder keg.
They just check out of the system.
Or they turn on it. They stop supporting the system. He actually references the 2016 election of Donald Trump to illustrate this.
Oh, really? How so?
He describes that election as these disaffected, alienated citizens throwing a massive wrench into the established political machinery.
Right. A disruption.
Exactly. They didn't vote for political continuity. They voted for disruption specifically because the system was no longer serving them.
So the dirty sidewalk itself isn't what brings down the empire. The complete loss of faith in the institutions that allowed the sidewalk to get dirty is what brings down the empire.
Precisely. When the core of an empire is rotting economically and socially, it loses the cohesive national will, the shared purpose, required to maintain its massive periphery, its global military and financial obligations.
That makes sense within his framework. But if the U.S. is alienating its population at home, how are the people in charge reacting to this?
Well, this brings us to a really fascinating transition in Jiang's narrative.
Yeah, because we move from what the elites are ignoring in their own backyards to how their isolated mindset drives incredibly reckless foreign policy abroad. He calls this the elite bubble.
And he is quite scathing in his description of this bubble.
Absolutely brutal.
He argues that the political and financial elites who initiate these global conflicts are entirely insulated from the consequences of their decisions.
They're untouched.
Right. They live in those heavily guarded Pacific Palisades fortresses. They host listless, detached dinner parties. They do not fight in the wars they start. Their children do not deploy to the front lines, and they don't even pay the true financial price for these conflicts.
Right, they just pass the bill on to working-class taxpayers through inflation and debt.
Exactly. And he paints a picture of a leadership class stuck in a deep, delusional nostalgia for the 1990s.
The unipolar moment. For those of you who might not remember the geopolitics of the 90s, this was a term coined after the Berlin Wall fell and the Soviet Union collapsed.
Right, the end of the Cold War.
Yeah, the U.S. was left standing as the single, unquestioned superpower, the fundamental force for global order. Thinkers like Francis Fukuyama were writing about the end of history, suggesting Western liberal democracy had permanently won.
Right.
Jiang argues today's elites still want to maintain that imperial hubris. They still want to feel like the unquestioned saviors of the world, and he claims they are willing to burn off the rest of domestic society just to maintain that psychological privilege.
And to explain how we got from the triumph of the 90s to the crises of today, Jiang introduces a highly counterintuitive, almost paradoxical historical perspective.
This part blew my mind a little bit.
Yeah, he argues that winning the Cold War, the total collapse of the Soviet Union, was actually a profound strategic disaster for the United States.
Winning the Cold War was a disaster.
According to him, yes.
That completely inverts the standard American historical narrative. How does winning a multi-decade standoff equal a disaster?
Well, according to his predictive model, it was a disaster because the Soviet Union acted as a necessary structural constraint on American ambition.
Okay, I see.
Because the Soviets possess a massive nuclear arsenal and a global reach, they forced the U.S. to embrace rigorous strategic thinking. American policymakers had to be measured.
They couldn't just do whatever they wanted.
Exactly. They had to carefully, painstakingly consider the cascading consequences of every single military or diplomatic action because a misstep meant global annihilation.
The muscle atrophy analogy comes to mind here.
Oh, that's a good one.
Right. Think of a champion bodybuilder who spends decades lifting incredibly heavy weights. Their muscles adapt and grow huge to handle that resistance.
Right.
But if they suddenly stop lifting entirely, those muscles don't just stay huge forever. They atrophy. They turn to mush. Jiang is essentially asking, if a superpower loses its biggest, heaviest geopolitical rival, does its strategic brain basically turn to mush?
That is the exact mechanism he is describing. Without a peer rival pushing back, the U.S. no longer had to make hard choices about prioritization.
It just assumed it could do it all.
Right. It assumed a strategy of total hegemony. It felt it needed to be everywhere, managing everything, having the final say in every corner of the planet.
Wow.
Jiang argues this absolute lack of resistance diminished strategic thinking in Washington. It bred an arrogance where policymakers felt they didn't even need to understand the complex historical or cultural backgrounds of the regions they were interfering in.
They assumed they already had all the answers.
Exactly. And this arrogance leads directly to imperial overstretch, exhausting your core domestic resources to fund endless interventions on the periphery.
It makes you wonder, can unchecked success, becoming the undisputed, unchallenged champion of the world with no one left to fight, actually be the single most dangerous thing that can happen to a nation?
To illustrate the historical precedent for this danger, Jiang reaches far back into antiquity.
Right, we're going to Rome.
Yeah. He uses the Roman Republic as a historical mirror for the United States, specifically focusing on the Punic Wars and the ultimate destruction of Carthage.
The history here is really fascinating. Carthage was Rome's great existential rival.
Right.
They were a massive naval and commercial empire based across the Mediterranean and North Africa in what is now modern-day Tunisia.
And they fought a series of brutal, exhausting wars over a century.
Yeah, Hannibal and the elephants.
Exactly. And Jiang points to the heated debates within the Roman Senate during this era. You had hardline figures like Cato the Elder. Cato famously ended virtually every single speech he gave in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the phrase, "Carthage must be destroyed."
Talk about staying on message.
Right. He viewed Carthage as the ultimate unforgivable threat to Roman supremacy and believed Rome could never be truly safe until Carthage was wiped off the map.
But Jiang highlights a crucial counter-narrative. He points out that there were other Roman senators and thinkers who warned vehemently against destroying Carthage.
Yeah, the skeptics.
They argued that Rome actually needed this terrifying enemy to balance them out.
It's that constraint idea again.
Exactly. The warning was prescient. They argued that without the constant looming threat of Carthage to keep the Roman political class disciplined, focused, and united, Rome would succumb to its worst impulses.
Right.
They warned Rome would grow arrogant, embark on pointless military adventures, expand its borders too fast, deeply financialize its economy, corrupt its elites, and eventually tear itself apart in civil wars.
And the historical record shows that Cato's faction won. Rome utterly destroyed Carthage in 146 BC, literally burning the city to the ground.
They salted the earth, right?
That's the legend, yeah. And just as the skeptics warned, the aftermath triggered the slow collapse of the Republic. The influx of slaves and wealth from conquered territories destroyed the Roman middle-class farmers, which was the bedrock of their military.
Oh, wow. So success hollowed them out.
Exactly. The elites bought up all the land, creating massive inequality. This led to populist uprisings, the breakdown of political norms, and roughly a century later, the Roman Republic collapsed entirely into dictatorship and endless civil war under figures like Caesar and Augustus.
It's wild how closely that mirrors some of the fears today.
Right. Jiang calls this phenomenon the Carthage trap. The total destruction of the great rival is the very catalyst that initiates the internal rot.
And he applies this Carthage trap framework directly to modern U.S. history.
Right, bringing it back to the present.
He argues that the post-Cold War era, culminating in the 2003 Iraq War, fed this dangerous illusion of invincibility.
Yeah.
The U.S. military went into Iraq, decimated the world's fourth largest army in a matter of weeks, and decapitated the regime with shocking speed. It looked like a total triumph of unipolar power.
And he also mentions a much more recent specific incident to highlight this ongoing hubris.
Oh, right, the Venezuela thing.
Yeah. A Delta Force strike in Venezuela on January 3rd of the year the interview took place. He claims in the interview that U.S. Special Forces successfully kidnapped the Venezuelan president, Nicolas Maduro, without suffering any casualties.
Okay, we have to hit the brakes here for a second and provide some crucial context.
Yes, absolutely.
We need to clearly state that there are conflicting international reports, heavy disputes, and very murky narratives about the exact nature, execution, and the actual players involved in the various covert operations or attempted coups against Maduro's government over the years.
It's a very tangled web.
Right. But within the strict context of Jane's narrative, he views this alleged operation as another instance of a flawless covert success that further feeds the American elite's imperial hubris.
Regardless of the operational specifics, Jiang's broader analytical point is about the psychology of the decision-makers.
Right, the mindset.
He is arguing that these perceived low-cost successes create a separate, distorted reality for the elite. They begin to genuinely believe that they possess a magic wand, that every intervention will perfectly go their way without long-term blowback.
And he says this distorted reality leads directly to current massive delusions, particularly regarding the Middle East.
Yeah, that's where he sees the biggest blind spot.
He argues the U.S. elite currently believe they can easily defeat Iran without suffering any catastrophic long-term consequences. He says Washington believes the sanctions are crippling the Iranian economy to the breaking point, that the Iranian leadership is in total disarray, and that the regime will simply surrender or collapse any day now.
It's that unipolar arrogance again.
Right. He quotes Donald Trump as essentially saying, "We're winning. Is it our fault if they don't recognize they're losing?" Jiang views this mindset as absolute textbook blindness caused by imperial arrogance. They are operating without a safety net. They literally do not have a plan B if the regime doesn't fold.
And this analysis of Washington's mindset raises an incredibly important question about how this theoretical overstretch actually manifests in the gritty, real world of domestic politics.
Right. How does this actually play out in D.C.?
Exactly. If the LA sidewalks are crumbling and the elites are delusional, how does this translate into actual foreign policy? This brings us to Jiang's analysis of the failure to retrench, focusing specifically on the Trump administration's America First movement and its actions in the Middle East.
In the interview, Glenn Diesen pushes back a bit on this point.
Yeah, he does.
He asks Jiang, wait a minute, didn't a massive portion of the American electorate recognize this imperial overstretch? Wasn't that the entire foundational appeal of Donald Trump's America First platform in 2016?
That was certainly the pitch.
The core idea being that the U.S. desperately needs to scale back the empire, shed some of these endless international commitments, stop nation building, and restore fiscal discipline at home.
That was undeniably the initial interpretation and the primary draw for millions of voters. It was marketed as a sharp pivot away from the neoconservative interventionism of the early 2000s.
Right.
But Jiang argues that instead of actual retrenchment and withdrawal, the U.S. is currently facing the prospect of more wars.
Which seems like a paradox.
It does. And to explain this contradiction, he deeply analyzes what he sees as a severe factional divide within the Trump administration itself.
The way he breaks this down is incredibly specific and highly controversial.
Very.
Jiang claims the Trump administration is not a unified monolith executing a single vision. Rather, it is split into two actively warring factions vying for control over foreign policy.
He identifies the first group as Faction A, which he labels the true America First faction.
Okay, who's in that group?
He points to figures like the commentator Tucker Carlson, former Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, and Senator J.D. Vance as the ideological leaders here. According to Jiang's model, this group genuinely wants to execute the original promise. Withdraw from sprawling global commitments, avoid foreign entanglements, and focus resources entirely on rebuilding the hollowed-out domestic manufacturing capacity of the United States.
But then he introduces the counterweight, Faction B, and he explicitly calls this the Israel First lobby within the administration.
Right.
He names specific individuals like Pete Hegseth, Michael Waltz, the financier Howard Lutnick, and Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Jiang claims this group pushes a highly aggressive, deeply interventionist policy specifically focused on reshaping the Middle East.
And this is where Jiang introduces a very bold, highly personalized claim regarding how policy is actually decided.
Yeah, this part is pretty wild.
He argues that policy isn't being driven by grand strategy, but by personal loyalty.
Okay.
He points to Trump's 4 years out of office, what he calls Trump's exile. This was a period marked by intense pressure. The FBI raids on Mar-a-Lago, numerous sprawling civil and criminal lawsuits, and severe financial and corporate pressures.
Jiang argues that during those darkest days, when many traditional Republican allies distanced themselves, the people who stayed most fiercely and financially loyal to Trump were the supporters of this Israel First faction.
Right.
He specifically names the late casino magnate Sheldon Adelson, calling him Trump's most crucial financial backer, and Sean Hannity, the influential Fox News host, whom Jiang describes as an ardent Christian Zionist.
Okay, so he's drawing lines between the money, the media, and the policy.
Exactly. Jiang's thesis is that because this specific faction never abandoned Trump when he was most vulnerable, Trump now feels a profound, unbreakable personal loyalty to them.
Jiang uses this theory of transactional personal loyalty to explain a series of major paradigm-shifting foreign policy decisions made during Trump's tenure.
Right.
He points to the unilateral withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal negotiated under Obama. He points to the highly controversial decision to move the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem.
Which was a massive shift.
Huge. He points to the official U.S. recognition of Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. And perhaps most explosively, he points to the drone strike assassination of the powerful Iranian general Qasem Soleimani.
Right.
Jiang claims these monumental actions were not necessarily part of a grand geopolitical chess match, but were essentially transactional rewards granted for that unwavering personal loyalty, a dynamic that he believes is culminating in an inevitable, catastrophic escalation of war with Iran.
So wait, instead of grand strategy, Jiang is saying U.S. foreign policy is operating like a mafia loyalty payback system.
Essentially, yes.
I have to jump in here and push back heavily on this framing.
Please do.
Reducing incredibly complex, multi-decade geopolitical alliances entirely to personal favors or the influence of a single-issue faction feels incredibly reductive, if not entirely conspiratorial.
It definitely simplifies a lot of history.
The U.S.-Israel alliance has deep strategic, historical, military, and intelligence-sharing roots that stretch back half a century, long before Donald Trump ever descended that golden escalator.
Right, it's institutionalized.
Exactly. How can an administration simultaneously be characterized by Jiang as a collapsing, isolationist, America First entity, while also being a highly effective, interventionist, Israel First war machine? Isn't it vastly more likely that these are complex, sometimes contradictory strategic interests being navigated by a sprawling bureaucracy,
rather than just a simple loyalty reward system.
Your critique is entirely valid, and it points to a common weakness in highly centralized, personality-driven theories of international relations.
They miss the forest for the trees.
Right. It often ignores the massive, slow-moving inertia of the State Department, the Pentagon, and decades of established treaty obligations.
Right.
However, to fully understand Jiang's predictive framework, we must temporarily suspend that critique and look at how he views the consequences of this alleged dynamic. Because in his view, this factional victory is actively, currently engulfing the entire Middle East in a sprawling, uncontrollable conflict.
And he focuses heavily on the Houthis in Yemen to illustrate this chaos. For context, Yemen sits right at the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, one of the most critical maritime choke points in the world for oil shipments.
Very important geography there.
The Houthis are a Zaidi Shia political and armed group that controls much of northern Yemen. Jiang states they represent an absolute existential threat to neighboring Saudi Arabia.
Because they can strike across the border.
Right, and because of this escalating threat, he claims Saudi Arabia is panicking and has recently signed military defense pacts with Turkey and Pakistan, and is actively considering bringing Egypt into this new alliance.
Jiang envisions a highly volatile scenario developing rapidly. He predicts that this multinational Sunni coalition, comprising Saudi money, Egyptian manpower, Pakistani logistics, and Turkish forces, is preparing to launch a massive coordinated ground invasion against the Houthis in Yemen.
And he warns this would be a historic, unmitigated disaster for everyone involved.
Oh, totally.
The geography of Yemen is brutal. It's incredibly mountainous, perfect for guerrilla warfare.
It's notoriously difficult terrain.
He describes the Houthis as heavily fortified in these mountains, battle-hardened from years of civil war, heavily armed and supported by Iran, and possessing sophisticated drone and ballistic missile technology that is entirely capable of reaching and destroying the fragile, concentrated Saudi energy infrastructure.
Right, the oil facilities.
Yeah. He paints a picture of complete regional chaos, a firestorm driven entirely, in his view, by the U.S. factional failure to actually retrench and leave the region.
This leads us to a profound contradiction in the imperial model.
Okay, what is it?
If the U.S. is stretched this dangerously thin globally, dealing with these massive proxy conflicts in the Middle East, suffering from domestic decay, and struggling under the weight of a $40 trillion national debt, how does it treat its long-standing, wealthy allies?
If the LA sidewalks are crumbling and the LA elites are dragging us into Middle Eastern quagmires, how is the empire funding all of this? This brings us to an incredibly shocking claim Jiang makes about how the U.S. interacts with its oldest friends. The traditional, mainstream view is that the U.S. provides a global security umbrella, keeping the sea lanes open, deterring aggression, and in return, occasionally asks its allies to pay their fair share of defense spending.
Right, burden sharing.
We call it burden sharing, yeah.
But Jiang fundamentally aggressively rejects the very concept of burden sharing. He introduces a much darker, far more predatory concept. He calls it cannibalization.
Cannibalization.
Yeah. He claims the United States is no longer protecting its allies. It is deliberately, systematically forcing them, Europe, Japan, the wealthy Gulf states, into regional conflicts specifically in order to subsidize and artificially prop up the failing U.S. domestic economy.
Wait, instead of the U.S. acting like a team captain collecting dues to buy new uniforms for the squad, Jiang is saying America is acting like a vampire, deliberately draining the blood of its own teammates just to keep itself alive.
The vampire theory is exactly what he is arguing. He breaks down the economic mechanism behind this. He argues that the U.S. fiat currency, the dollar, would collapse under the weight of its own debt if there wasn't constant, massive global demand for it.
Right, the petrodollar system.
Yes. The petrodollar system requires the world to need U.S. currency. So how do you artificially manufacture that demand when your domestic manufacturing base is hollowed out?
Oh.
According to Jiang, you force your allies into terrifying security crises with their neighbors. You pit Japan against China. You pit Europe against Russia. You pit the Gulf states against Iran.
And once they are suitably terrified of an imminent invasion, you spring the trap. You sell them massive amounts of American weapons.
Bingo.
They have to buy these weapons using U.S. dollars, which recycles their wealth back into the American financial system, propping up the debt.
Exactly.
But Jiang takes it a step further. He claims these weapon systems the U.S. forces its allies to buy are vastly overpriced, often redundant, and in some critical cases, completely useless for the actual threats they face.
Right. He uses a very specific example here.
Yeah, he cites a news story about Gulf nations like Kuwait and Bahrain being pressured into buying 5,000 Patriot missile defense systems from the United States.
To back up his claim that this is a financial scam rather than a security umbrella, he references Ted Postel.
Who are the?
Postel is a prominent, often controversial professor emeritus of science, technology, and national security policy at MIT.
Okay.
Jiang uses Postel's analysis to support his claim that the Patriot missile defense systems simply do not work effectively against the specific type of modern, high-velocity ballistic missiles that Iran possesses.
Wait, they don't work?
Well, the argument is based on the physics of interception. Trying to hit a supersonic warhead with another missile often results in the warhead still falling on the target, even if the missile body is destroyed.
Wow.
Jiang argues the Pentagon knows this. The point isn't to actually win a potential war or protect the ally. The point is to force the ally to take on debt to buy useless multi-million-dollar systems purely to finance the U.S. Treasury.
The cynicism in that analysis is just staggering.
It's very dark.
And he applies this exact same vampire logic to Europe.
Jiang's assessment of the European political class is absolutely brutal.
He doesn't hold back.
He says that if Europe were truly independent, if they were left to their own sovereign devices, they would immediately sign a mutually beneficial, pragmatic peace and trade treaty with Russia. They need the cheap energy. Russia needs the capital. But instead of pursuing their own economic interests, he says they are, quote, sleepwalking into a tragedy.
He paints the entire European Union political system in Brussels as a zombie bureaucracy.
A zombie bureaucracy?
Yeah. He claims European leaders aren't acting out of a genuine ideological hatred for Russia, nor are they even acting under direct, explicit coercion by the Americans. Rather, they are acting out of a sheer institutional lack of imagination and a total collapse of political will.
Right.
He describes a culture of bureaucrats who are just waiting to collect their fat pensions, planning their summer vacations in the Mediterranean, and simply taking the path of least resistance, which currently means following Washington's lead over clay.
And he predicts this bureaucratic sleepwalking is going to end in a bloodbath. He says it will eventually lead to European governments being forced to conscript their own young men to fight in the trenches of Eastern Europe, an action he predicts will immediately trigger massive, violent political revolutions across the continent.
This dire prediction is deeply tied to his highly controversial characterization of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine.
All right, we have to talk about how he views Ukraine.
Jiang does not view this as a war between a sovereign Ukraine defending its territory and an aggressive Russian invader. He strips all agency away from Kiev.
Right.
He characterizes it purely, 100%, as a NATO proxy war designed to bleed Russia and subordinate Europe.
He goes so far as to literally call Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky a paid actor.
Yeah, that's a direct quote.
He views him merely as a proxy reading a script written by NATO intelligence. He claims Ukraine as a nation is entirely exhausted, riddled with corruption, and completely out of available manpower, only continuing to fight because Western financial and military support artificially keeps the war alive.
And he points to what he sees as desperate attempts by this proxy to widen the war, to force direct, kinetic U.S. involvement. He specifically brings up an incident involving a Ukrainian drone strike on an Iranian cargo ship located in the Caspian Sea.
For those of you picturing the map, the Caspian Sea is geographically very far removed from the front lines in the Donbass.
Very far.
It borders Russia, Iran, and several Central Asian nations, so why strike there?
Well,
Jiang argues this was a deliberate, highly calculated strategic stunt by Zelensky.
okay.
The goal was to physically unite the two separate geopolitical fronts. By attacking Iranian assets with Western weapons, Zelensky was trying to prove to Washington that Russia and Iran are a single, unified enemy.
Right, linking them together.
The logic is, if the U.S. eventually wants to fight Iran in the Middle East, it has to commit to destroying Russia and Ukraine first. Jiang claims the Biden administration actually wasn't interested in merging these two massive conflicts and supposedly forced Zelensky to apologize behind closed doors, but Jiang expects more of these dangerous escalatory stunts as Ukraine grows more desperate.
Furthermore, Jiang views domestic politics within Europe through this exact same lens of imperial manipulation and cannibalization.
The controlled opposition thing.
Yes. He discusses the concept of controlled opposition being actively utilized by the U.S. empire.
He uses Spain as his primary example here. He cites a major border incident where roughly 50,000 migrants suddenly flooded into Ceuta, which is a tiny Spanish enclave located on the North African coast bordering Morocco.
Right.
He claims this massive influx wasn't organic migration. It was a deliberate crisis orchestrated by Moroccan authorities to put tremendous destabilizing political pressure on Spain's ruling left-wing coalition government.
And what is the purpose of this engineered pressure?
Yeah, why do it?
According to Yang, it is to deliberately pave the way for the hard-right Vox Party to sweep into power in Spain.
Okay, but why does the empire want that?
Because he claims the leadership of the Vox Party is aggressively pro-war, staunchly pro-Zionist, and deeply aligned with the overarching strategic goals of the American empire. It is a staggering, multi-layered conspiracy claim that mass migration is being actively weaponized and coordinated by U.S. allies like Morocco to topple non-compliant European governments and install hawkish regimes that will eagerly participate in the cannibalization process.
So wait, the U.S. is orchestrating African migration into Spain to prop up the dollar.
That's the argument.
I have to jump in again, because the leap in logic here is massive. We really need to challenge this underlying assertion that Europe has absolutely zero agency of its own.
It's a very deterministic view.
Jiang paints the entire continent as either mindless zombies waiting for pensions or helpless pawns being manipulated by CIA border crises. But isn't it entirely plausible, actually highly probable, that European nations, especially those geographically bordering Russia like Poland, Finland, or the Baltic states, have their own very real sovereign security fears?
Oh, undoubtedly.
Fears that have absolutely nothing to do with subsidizing U.S. debt and everything to do with their own historical trauma and the very real fact that a neighboring nuclear power just launched a full-scale armored invasion of a sovereign country.
That is the most robust, frequent critique of this kind of totalizing anti-imperial framework.
Right.
When you view everything exclusively through the lens of U.S. hegemony, it often strips regional actors of their own complex histories, internal politics, and genuine survival instincts.
It ignores local context.
Completely. Poland's fear of Russia predates the United States' existence as a country. Reducing their military buildup to merely subsidizing U.S. debt ignores centuries of European history.
Exactly.
But again, our goal today is to map out Jiang's chessboard, not to correct his placement of the pieces.
Fair enough.
And on his board, Europe is entirely a vassal state being bled dry, which forces us to look to the other side of the globe, to Asia, to see how the other great power, China, is responding to this strategy of global cannibalization.
Right. If the U.S. is burning its bridges in Europe and the Middle East, what is happening in the Pacific? According to Jiang, what is Beijing doing while Washington is supposedly devouring its allies?
Jiang argues that China's classic overarching geopolitical strategy is to maintain strict neutrality in these global flashpoints in order to maximize its long-term economic options.
So they're just sitting back and watching.
Basically, he claims China's primary directive is to avoid kinetic warfare at all costs, preferring economic integration over military conquest.
The obvious counterpoint to that is Taiwan.
Right. Everyone always points to Taiwan.
But Jiang addresses this directly. He says China genuinely wants peaceful political reunification with the island. He notes that a prominent Taiwanese opposition leader, Cheng Liwen, recently visited Beijing and was warmly welcomed by Xi Jinping.
Right.
Jiang believes this proves China thinks it can achieve reunification slowly, using economic leverage and political persuasion over decades without a single shot ever being fired across the strait.
But he argues the U.S. will not allow that peaceful integration to happen.
Of course not.
He claims the U.S. is aggressively, actively trying to provoke a kinetic conflict in the Pacific to justify its military presence and contain China's rise.
Right.
He points to a multi-pronged approach, punishing new U.S. tariffs, devastating technology sanctions on Chinese companies, and the formalization of the Quad alliance.
And the Quad is a strategic security dialogue between the U.S., Japan, India, and Australia, clearly designed to encircle China.
Exactly. And within that strategy, he focuses incredibly heavily on Japan.
Why Japan?
He claims Japan is currently terrified. Their fear is that if China successfully takes over Taiwan, Beijing would suddenly control the crucial maritime trade routes that Japan desperately relies on for energy and exports.
Ah, the supply lines.
Yes. Because of this existential economic fear, he notes that Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba is rapidly pushing to remilitarize the country, moving away from their post-WWII pacifist constitution.
And here, Jiang makes another explosive claim regarding the deep vassalization of an ally. He claims the U.S. isn't just encouraging Japan to rearm. He claims Washington is actively building a localized deep state within Japan.
Right.
creating brand new intelligence agencies mirroring the structure of the CIA and the FBI. The alleged goal is so that American intelligence can bypass elected Japanese officials and impose Washington's will directly through these newly minted, U.S.-aligned Japanese security agencies.
If Japan is being turned into a heavily armed, U.S.-controlled proxy right on China's doorstep, how does Beijing counter that without starting World War III?
Yeah, what is their move?
Yan describes what he sees as a massive, intricate 3D chess move by Xi Jinping, and it involves utilizing North Korea.
This part is wild.
It is. He notes the timing of diplomatic visits. Shortly after Vladimir Putin and Donald Trump, during his presidency, made highly publicized visits to China or met with Chinese leadership, Xi Jinping made a very rare personal state visit to North Korea to meet with Kim Jong-un.
Okay, here's the convoluted logic Jiang lays out, and it requires a deep understanding of Japanese domestic politics.
Walk us through it.
China desperately wants to stop Japan from remilitarizing. But China can't attack Japan directly. So, China uses North Korea as a blunt point of leverage. The theory is that Beijing will essentially give Pyongyang the green light to act aggressively, to start lobbing test missiles over or very near the Japanese home islands.
Which they've done.
Right. And the Japanese public, which still harbors a massive, deeply ingrained cultural pacifist streak stemming from the trauma of WWII, will be absolutely terrified by these missile launches.
Okay.
But this terror won't unite them behind the military. Rather, Jiang predicts the terrified public will launch massive, paralyzing domestic protests against their own government's aggressive remilitarization plans.
Oh, I see.
This intense domestic pressure will force the Japanese government to back down, halt the military buildup, and eventually compromise with China regarding the status of Taiwan.
So wait, instead of direct diplomacy, Jiang is saying China's strategy is like trying to scare your neighbor into moving his property line by handing a box of fireworks to the local pyromaniac and telling him to go play in the neighbor's dry grass.
That is a brilliant analogy.
Does Jiang's theory give China way too much credit for operational control, though? Does Beijing really possess a master dial where they can perfectly control North Korea's incredibly paranoid, unpredictable, and aggressive actions without it blowing up in their own face?
It is an incredibly high-stakes assumption. Assuming North Korea is simply a remote-controlled drone for Isha, Xi Jinping ignores Pyongyang's own intense agency, its extreme regime paranoia, and its desperate survival imperatives.
It's treating them like a chess piece, not a country.
However, Jiang views the world strictly through a structuralist lens where the major powers expertly manipulate the minor ones. And he points to one final massive strategic maneuver by China to ensure it cannot be strangled by this U.S. encirclement, securing the Arctic escape route.
Right. He brings up the Malacca dilemma.
Yes, the Malacca dilemma. For those who haven't looked at a naval map of Southeast Asia recently, the Strait of Malacca is this incredibly narrow stretch of water situated between Malaysia and the Indonesian island of Sumatra.
It's tiny.
It is a massive geographic choke point. A staggering percentage of China's entire economy, its exported manufactured goods, and its critically needed energy imports from the Middle East must physically pass through that tiny strait.
And the U.S. knows that.
If the U.S. Navy's 7th Fleet decides to park a few destroyers there and blockade that strait, China's economy suffocates in a matter of weeks. They run out of oil.
To completely bypass this fatal vulnerability, Jiang notes that China is partnering intimately with Russia to develop and heavily secure an alternative trade route through the Arctic, often called the Northern Sea Route.
Right.
As global warming continues to melt the polar ice caps for longer periods each year, and with the help of Russia's massive fleet of nuclear icebreakers, this northern route becomes a highly viable, entirely secure way to move goods to Europe, completely bypassing the U.S. Navy's control of the southern oceans.
We have painted a sprawling, complex geopolitical chessboard today.
We really have.
We've covered proxy wars in the snows of Ukraine, zombie bureaucracies in Brussels, proxy missiles flying over the Sea of Japan, and nuclear icebreakers carving escape routes in the Arctic. But in our final section, Jiang takes all of this grand strategy and brings it crashing violently back down to the microscopic human level.
Right, back to the individual.
How does all of this imperial overstretch actually end for the average, everyday citizen walking down the street?
This brings us to his final argument, which we can call the 1848 warning. And he initiates this dire prediction with an incredibly visceral, almost absurdly personal complaint about daily life.
Remember, he's in Los Angeles staying in a luxury hotel, and he spends a significant portion of the interview complaining bitterly about the quality of American food.
The food complaint.
He literally states that American food is pure poison. He claims that despite eating at high-end, well-reviewed restaurants in West Hollywood, he contracted a severe stomach illness and had travelers' diarrhea for 4 days straight. He blames this on the systemic corruption of the food supply, citing GMOs, unregulated growth hormones, microplastics, whatever he believes the corporations are legally allowed to pump into the agricultural system.
It sounds like a petty Yelp review, but he elevates this gastrointestinal distress into a major sociological observation.
He turns it into a metaphor.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he doesn't just complain about the stomach ache, he questions the psychological state of a public that tolerates it. He views the American public's silent acceptance of this degraded, chemically altered food quality as a profound, undeniable symptom of a beaten-down, entirely passive society.
Wow.
He asks, why are Americans quietly putting up with this literal poison?
I mean, we all know European food safety standards are vastly different, and the FDA allows certain additives that are banned elsewhere. But using a bout of traveler's diarrhea as a foundational geopolitical indicator for the collapse of a superpower.
It's a stretch.
Is a bad stomach bug in LA really the opening salvo of the fall of Rome, or did the guy just eat a bad oyster at a seafood spot on Sunset Boulevard?
It's certainly a darkly amusing leap of logic, but it serves a very specific rhetorical purpose in his model.
Right.
He is intentionally painting a portrait of a domestic population that is physically degraded, biologically compromised, and morally exhausted, suffering indignities in silence. And he uses this image of a weakened populace to compare the current state of Western societies directly to the fragile state of Europe just before the massive upheavals of the year 1848.
The 1848 revolutions. Historians often call it the Spring of Nations. It was a series of political upheavals that swept across almost the entire European continent.
Exactly. In the early 1840s, Europe looked relatively stable and peaceful on the surface. The monarchs were in control. But underneath that calm facade, all the necessary ingredients for a massive explosion were quietly simmering.
What were they?
Severe, grinding economic malaise for the working class, vast and visible wealth inequality, rampant political corruption, and an aloof aristocratic elite completely disconnected from the daily suffering of the urban masses.
Yang says these modern Western societies are identical powder kegs.
Identical.
The elites are in the Pacific Palisades. The masses are on Skid Row eating expensive poison. The fuel is everywhere. They just need a spark. And he notes that in 1848, the spark wasn't initially political, it was agricultural.
Right, the famine.
It was a weather-driven famine. Massive crop failures, including the potato blight, caused the price of basic bread and food to absolutely skyrocket. Urban workers who were already spending most of their wages on food suddenly couldn't afford to eat. When hunger hits, fear vanishes, and suddenly the entire continent was engulfed in flames of violent revolution, toppling governments overnight.
And Jiang predicts a direct modern equivalent to this spark.
What's the modern spark?
He theorizes that the reckless foreign policy we discussed, specifically a massive escalation of the looming war with Iran, will be the catalyst. A major war in the Middle East would immediately close the Strait of Hormuz, instantly choking off a massive percentage of the global oil supply.
Which would spike prices instantly.
Exactly. This massive energy shock will severely disrupt heavily optimized global supply chains. Oil spikes lead to fertilizer spikes, which he claims will cause immediate famines in vulnerable regions like Africa and lead to skyrocketing food prices and massive, uncontrollable inflation right here in the United States.
And here is the terminal point of his predictive model. When that economic pain tolerance is finally breached, when the LA working class can no longer afford the $17 avocado toast, let alone basic groceries, and when these multi-trillion-dollar artificial bubbles, like the AI market and the shadow-banking private credit bubble, finally pop under the pressure of inflation, Jiang predicts a sudden, massive, and deeply violent societal collapse. The LA streets won't just be dirty, they will be burning.
It is a truly cataclysmic, terrifying vision of the near future.
It really is.
But as analysts, this raises a vital question about resilience that we must consider. Can modern 21st century financial tools, highly coordinated central banks, and a hyper-globalized, digitally connected economy absorb and mitigate these shocks better than the rigid, fragile agrarian economies of 1848 Europe?
That's a good point.
We have complex social safety nets, dynamic monetary policies, and redundant global trade networks that simply did not exist during the Spring of Nations.
That is the trillion-dollar question. Has our technology made us more resilient to collapse, or have we just used that technology to build a much taller, much more precarious house of cards?
Let's pull back and summarize the core thesis of the incredible, sprawling journey Jiang Xueqin has taken us on today.
Yeah, we covered a lot of ground. We started on the ground level, looking at human waste on a luxurious Hollywood sidewalk as a symbol of a completely broken social contract between the state and its citizens. We moved to the historical theory of the Carthage trap, exploring the idea that losing the Soviet Union actually caused the U.S. to lose its strategic discipline, leading to arrogant, unwinnable, forever wars managed by insulated elites.
We explored the deeply cynical claim that the U.S. operates as a vampire empire, desperate to manage its $40 trillion debt by deliberately cannibalizing its own allies in Europe and Asia.
And it all ends with the dark prediction that this systemic overstretch will inevitably lead to a spark-likely massive inflation or supply chain collapse triggered by a Middle Eastern war that ignites a massive 1848-style societal revolt.
It is a sweeping, deeply interconnected, and highly deterministic view of world history. And I want to remind our listeners one final time. This deep dive was a structural exploration of Jiang's specific predictive model.
Right.
It is a worldview heavily colored by his own biases, his interpretations of opaque geopolitical events, and a very specific reading of history. Our goal was to outline the architecture of his narrative, not to establish these highly contentious claims as absolute, undeniable truths.
Exactly. We are here to map the maze, not tell you which path to walk. But walking through his model does leave us with a lingering, deeply provocative thought.
Let's hear it.
Let's assume, just for a second, that Jiang is fundamentally right about the underlying psychology of the Carthage trap.
Okay.
Let's assume the human empires actually need a massive, terrifying, mortal enemy in order to stay disciplined, to stay focused on the common good, and to avoid rotting from the inside out due to hubris and greed.
If that psychological need for an enemy is a hardwired truth of human civilization, what does that mean for our highly globalized modern world?
Right.
In antiquity, Rome could solve its problem by simply marching across the sea and destroying Carthage with swords and fire. But in the modern era, with thousands of hypersonic nuclear weapons on hair-trigger alert and deeply intertwined, fragile global economies, engaging in a true existential conflict with a modern Carthage wouldn't lead to a unipolar moment of triumph. It might mean mutually assured destruction for the entire human race.
So if we can't afford to fight a Carthage, is it possible for a modern superpower to maintain its internal discipline, uphold its social contract, and care for its citizens purely from within?
That's a challenge.
Can we find the political will to fix the streets, lower the cost of living, and build an equitable society without needing the terrifying threat of a foreign boogeyman to unite us? Or is human nature simply doomed to repeat this endless cycle of triumph, hubris, overstretch, and collapse? It's certainly something to think about the next time you find yourself driving past a $20 million mansion sitting empty on a hill.